Okay, good morning everyone in Australia and good evening to anyone in North or South America. For the few that decided to join from Europe, I hope you're asleep and watching the recording because it's a crazy hour there. Today, inclusive leadership. It's become quite a buzz term of late. Should it be something we take more seriously? Our panelists here believe that it is, and that's what we want to talk about today. My name's Mel. I'm responsible for APAC sales at Vervoe. I joined because of their mission to remove bias from the recruitment process, something I've always felt quite passionate about. So for this reason, I'm very excited to announce our three speakers that join us today. Thank you all for your time. We have Emma. Emma Jones, who's worked in people and talent space across the globe. She is the founder of Project F, an unapologetic feminist, and is on a mission to change the culture of tech. Project F's program 50/50 is all about balance and equality, not representation, and it's creating real change for organizations. We also have Isa Noderman, who has over 17 years working in the people and culture space with the likes of Google, Pandora, Spotify, specializing in working in fast-paced, progressive tech organizations in early stage and high growth phases. Now at Melbourne-based startup Linktree as the global head of people and culture. So welcome. And we have Dr. Jennifer Whelan, who is the founding director of Synapse Psychometrics, a former research fellow at the Melbourne Business School and the University of Melbourne, recognised academic expert and organisational consultant specialising in diversity and inclusive leadership, unconscious bias, decision-making and innovation. So very, very excited to have the three of you joining us today. Let's start off with what is inclusive leadership and what's the return on investment. I think diversity and inclusion is something that's been discussed a lot recently. Many organizations are adding it as a box ticking exercise, complete unconscious bias training, and then there's little to no follow-up. So just yesterday, I read an article in BBC that was a job ad for a football club that literally stated, if you need to pick up your kids from school, you don't need to apply, hard workers only. So what are we talking about when we talk about inclusive leaders, and why should businesses care, or should it just be another box tick that everyone does? I'll hand it over to you.
Who's going to speak first? After those introductions, I've already got a bit of imposter syndrome now. So let's.
I'm happy to kick off if that helps break the ice. Inclusion is best for me described through a little bit of a thought experiment, right? Imagine yourself new to a role, new to an organization. You're coming in to pull your team together for the first time. You walk in the door, you see a bunch of people who look pretty much like yourself. You have the same skin color, you're mostly the same gender, you speak the same language, you have things in common, you can build rapport, you can take shortcuts. I know what you mean, you know what I mean. You can cut to the chase. Probably don't have to bring your A game because we're all on the same page. You can ride off this sense of naturally existing cohesion and consensus. You get to the answer quickly and you'll feel really nice about it. It's your business as usual kind of room. And if you're solving business as usual problems, that's okay. It's fair enough. It does the job. We think about a second room that you might walk into where you see a room of people who are different to you. They're different to each other. You don't know what I mean. I don't know what you mean. We're going to have to ask questions. We're going to have to check ourselves. We're going to have to give more explanations. You are going to have to bring your A game. You might get challenged by different perspectives. You will have to do that case-making, persuasive evidence work to build consensus. It might not happen as quickly. And it's not going to feel as comfortable, that's for sure. You've got to do so much more work. Now, when you ask the question, which of these two rooms feels more comfortable and more efficient, of course it's room one. When you ask the question, which of these two rooms is more future fit, is more agile, is more capable of making sound, robust, defensible decisions, is more capable of coming up with breakthrough solutions, it is absolutely room two, hands down, every time. Now, what's the point of inclusion? The point of inclusion is that it turns room two into a high-performing team. It's the glue that turns a ragtag bunch of diverse people into a high-performing team. It's the psychological safety to have a different view, to question an old way of doing things, to have a crazy, wacky left field idea, the freedom to be yourself, to experiment, to fail, to admit you don't know, that makes room two such a productive place. That's what inclusion is to me. And if you ask, what's the return on investment? And any high-performing team is an inclusive team. It is about driving performance and growing collective capability, not about box ticking, not about head counting, or any of those things. It is really about how do you grow the collective capability of a group of people. You can't do it without an inclusive way of working. So, for me, that's what inclusion is.
I love that, Jen.
Yeah.
So good. Hard to match that.
Just one perspective, jump in.
I was going to say, I think, one of the things about inclusion, that was a great description. And I think one of the things about inclusivity or inclusion is that it's probably invisible to most of, those who enjoy it the most. And I think that's what makes it such a difficult one for when we talk about measures. And people really understanding inclusion is because the people who are trying to understand it for the most part are the people who enjoy it the most. So it's invisible to them. The thing that's easier to understand is the exclusion.
Absolutely. If you want to back of the envelope definition of inclusion, a culture that values difference, that thinks of difference as a performance edge, as an asset to be leveraged rather than a bump to be smoothed over. When you think about this at the question of what's our culture, and culture fit and all of those things, organizations, in my experience, tend to guard their culture a little bit too closely. They don't allow it to grow and to flex and to breathe and to adapt. And inclusion is really, as you point out, I think, Emma, it's a mindset switch. It's not how do we fit these diverse people into the way we are. It's about how do we flex and adapt and grow to take better advantage of the differences that we bring in. And that's a huge mindset shift question at the cultural level in an organization, but then also at the personal awareness level, as you point out, Emma.
Yeah, that's some really great points. If we circle back to that ROI, Isa, you've worked on a lot of significant projects, and the goal is, I guess, as Jennifer said, making that room to the entire business that have been focused on achieving diversity through inclusion. There was the Global Belonging Summit and reverse mentoring that you did at Spotify. Mm-hmm. Could you share some of the business impacts you've seen from doing these sorts of projects?
Yeah, for sure. Just to add to the previous question, I would say that inclusive leadership is a discipline. It's not something that you sort of add on as a nice to have sort of attachment to what you already do as a leader. It should be sort of your core discipline. It should be how you enable and unlock the potential of your team, and how you drive deep connection between all the individuals, the sum of all the parts of your team, and move them towards those really clear critical objectives of the business that you want to achieve. And I think what we miss is that it always feels like it's something else we have to do. But when we start from it at the core, as our core discipline, inclusive leadership then becomes a very natural and authentic and sincere approach to leadership as a whole. So I just wanted to kind of add that little bit of flavor there, because I think it sort of feeds into my answer to this next question, is around to really, develop the ROI and to unlock the business potential as an outcome of doing this, incredibly important diversity and inclusion and belonging work. You have to have leaders at the very beginning and at the forefront who champion it, who believe it, who have their own why. And I'm not saying their why has to be the same, but their why has to be specific to them to speak through that mission and that why to unlock and to draw the connection with what they're trying to achieve. So for us, it's around, when I was at Spotify, was really around mobilizing everyone around their why. Let's unlock that and use that why in individuals to drive them towards something that makes the most sense for them. So the Belonging Summit was one such way that we did that. Is we have people who are deeply committed, deeply passionate, know this matters somehow, but don't know how to activate around it.
Yeah.
Feel like it's scary, it's uncertain. I'm a white, straight, cisgender male. How can I possibly make a difference here? And really unlocking that within individuals so they can go about doing the work in their space of the organization that's going to drive better diverse outcomes for more people. And obviously much greater business success. And what we uncovered through those processes is that we came up with much better practices and much better applications of the work that we were doing. We would sort of come into rooms with a really robust, diverse set of folks. And again, you know, no one knew each other. Everyone was sort of uncomfortable by being the only one of themselves in that space. But what that helped us do is it sort of disarmed everyone and enabled us to just come together as humans and really connect on that level and go, here, we're here and we're committed to driving better outcomes for our business. And that foundation really started the conversation for higher level thinking, for understanding the systems that got us to this place. And that's how we sort of designed a lot of the work, is around how do we dismantle the systems that have enabled some groups to thrive and some to only just survive. And that was really the approach that we took. I think it's a very powerful approach.
I think that's a really great point, Isa, about, you know, inclusion or inclusive leadership. It's not another style of, another leadership thing we have to do. As you point out, it's not another thing you have to do. Yeah. It's a way of doing everything that you do, or it should infuse everything that you already do, for sure.
But we don't typically see inclusivity given as certainly from what I see in tech, we don't see that as given as the sort of baseline for leadership. So 101 leadership training is along the lines of how to conduct a 101, how to give feedback, how to manage team collaboration, how to set goals. It's the standard 101, and I see a huge gap in an understanding of what inclusive leadership actually means, which is what you've described, but I don't see it being instilled in our leaders, especially not in technology where perhaps we need it the most. And it's like we have this expectation that technology leaders, especially in these hyper-growth tech environments, where we're not giving our leaders the space to be leaders. We're giving them their expectation is to drive tech outcomes. So if we're talking about where women, for example, are most underrepresented in software engineering, the leaders in software engineering are mostly expected to be coders themselves. They're expected to be technologists, and so the way they're measured is a lot of the time is on that output, which is very tangible, but they're not given the tools to be able to, the tools or the space to be able to lead, let alone understanding of that, what it takes to be an inclusive leader and understanding differences and differences of lived experiences.
Yeah, and you're right. I think there's a certain point in most leaders' evolution where you stop being the chief problem solver, the best coder, the best engineer, the best accountant, and you really actually have to understand the more adaptive, dynamic skill of people. And inclusion is, I think, a great lever for many leaders to be able to do that. And you're right. I think I see it a lot in the tech firms that we work with too. This idea that the best technical skill is what gets you a leadership role, when in fact, as we move closer and closer to a point in time where machines will solve technical problems, people need to be able to solve for people problems, not technical problems. You need to step aside as the chief problem solver. You're not the chief problem solver. There's some fascinating research too, in terms of giving leaders permission to admit they don't know the answers to some of these people questions. Because I know leaders often feel when you talk about inclusion, I need to be all things to all people. How can I be all things to all people? There's some really interesting research about the empowering effects of leaders admitting, we've not done this before. I don't know how to reimagine this. Come into the space with me.
I like that. So the why is becoming clear. We're seeing, Isa, you mentioned the creating that discomfort and having groups come together, and they were delivering better outcomes. The benefits of having inclusive leaders right from the start, it's kind of starting to make sense. Jennifer, you've coached executives and leaders for many years now. What differences do you see in businesses where leaders have the skills to lead inclusively, and what kind of roll-on effect does that also have on businesses?
I find it hard to come up with like the prototype of leader who does this perfectly. It should be refreshing and reassuring to anyone aspiring to be an inclusive leader that there are many roads lead to Rome. There are lots of different ways of doing this, but the first skill I think that leaders I work with as they move on this journey is self-awareness, is to understand how the system works for you, how the fact that the system works for you doesn't mean it works for other people, that who you are and where you stand in any organizational system or social system heavily influences what your experience of it is going to be like. And so self-awareness is the first piece. We usually coach and teach around a model of inclusion that we call the heart, the head, and the habits of inclusion. And the self-awareness piece, or that empathic, skill-building, perspective-taking piece, is at the heart of inclusion, is the ability to understand that your experience is just, you know, sample size n equals 1, your experience, that other people's lived experience is just as valid and real for them, and it may be very, very different depending on where we sit in this system. And from there, you kind of have a gateway open to do a range of things, whether it be to tackle some of the systemic barriers I think that Isa was mentioning about before, that any system, no matter how nicely and sensitively it's designed, will enable some people to thrive more than it enables other people to thrive. So you can take that systems perspective in terms of how can we do things to break down some of the challenges that diverse people have in terms of their people experience. It also enables leaders to take a personal development approach around how do I insulate my own thinking and decision making against the impact, say, for example, of things like unconscious bias. How do I set new inclusive norms that run on their own using some of the kind of behavioural economics nudges and habit change techniques to start to create processes that are inclusive by design rather than things that require this constant daily effort and cognitive load. So they're kind of some of the common factors that I see in leaders who have had the motivation or the trigger to do this kind of work in the first place seriously, as opposed to go to a training course because I have to, and how they go about developing it. You know, we don't measure the return on investment of this work very well, because the impacts of inclusion and actually most people initiatives are difficult to measure. But I would argue that you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what would happen if you didn't do this work. It's pretty difficult to put a figure on, but certainly in terms of employee experience, we know it's incredibly, incredibly important and empowering.
Can I ask? Can I just quickly ask a question, Isa? I'm really interested to know, with your experience, I think your perspective on the internal workings of a company when you're leading a function that's around people and culture and diversity and inclusion. What are the barriers that you have experienced, and you think probably other people would experience, to achieving these sorts of outcomes, to impacting how leaders are, their capability around this particular, skill set?
Yeah, I've only ever worked in very fast-paced, hyper-growth organizations, tech specifically, so I'll speak from that lens. I would say time and speed and pace. It's almost like that is the one thing that is holding us back, where we have to make fast decisions around talent coming in. We have to promote people into leadership positions quickly. We have to build something that is, really quick and agile. And that seems to be where we lose out on having the moment of pause, deep reflection, introspection, building our own self-awareness, to Jennifer's point, that we tend to skip over in order to achieve a particular business outcome or result. And that feels like it's at most like the tension point with diversity and inclusion efforts, belonging efforts, and business outcomes, is like, we just don't have the time for this. And for me, that is something you can work with, but it's going to continue to just sort of raise its head and be like, okay, well, we'll work around that to get to this outcome. So if what I'm trying to do at Linktree is sort of build it into our status quo, build it into how we operate as an organization, rather than get so far down the track that we have to now course correct for it in retrospect, where no one wants to take the time to do that. No one wants to go off and develop a deep self-awareness around others' lived experiences, or dismantle the systems that have got them there to begin with. People want to just keep moving along that trajectory, that speed. It feels good, it's gratifying, it's validating. What we're doing is really trying to build it in at the ground level, and it's through lots of different initiatives sort of focused on the what I call the 4 key pillars, which I use a lot. I've used it in other settings where it's like, how do we do this in our business, in our product, in our operations? How do we do this in our culture? How do we do this with the lens on our talent and our people? And how do we do this in the communities in which we operate? And that approach allows everyone to have some buy-in. Everyone will find their why as it spans those 4 key pillars. Maybe it's just in one area. I just want to make this product accessible, or it's in over here where it's like, I want to mentor young women and girls into the tech sphere. Everyone will find their why as it relates to it, and then there's like really deep translatable sort of applications for it as well. But I'd say, my long and short answer would be speed and time.
I would agree. It's the single biggest challenge that comes up for me in my work with leaders is time, and it's the one thing you can't give anybody more of when you're trying to solve a problem. Is I can't give you more hours in the day. We do know there are things you can do to use time more effectively to dodge the impact of things like unconscious biases in decision making. So some hacks that you can use to use time or to take advantage of peak brain time more effectively. But for me, the heart, the head, and the habits of inclusion. For me, boringly enough, the habits are the habits of inclusion I think are the most powerful. That is the way you return to previous levels of efficiency. When you normalize something, it's the point of a habit. You do it a lot. It makes sense to automate it. When you automate it, it runs on its own, and you can put that extra brain power or time into the next small, simple change. So that for me is about cracking the code in terms of making this work run on its own in an everyday kind of way without us having to take extra time and put in extra effort, is by creating inclusive habits.
And so just on that point that you both just made, who's in a business, who's responsible for this? Does it fall onto HR? Does it fall onto the leaders? Like, we love passing the buck around of who should be looking after these, inclusiveness and diversity and inclusive leaders.
It's typically HR. I mean, from what I see with the customers that I talk to, is that they see HR as the owner. So people and culture, HR owns diversity and inclusion. And with the exception of individuals like Isa, who have, that's ingrained in their experience and background. So she has a very high level of expertise, deep expertise in this area. The majority of people and culture leaders don't. So they often will come from HR generalist backgrounds. They're not experts in diversity and inclusion. So they have to my experience is that it's almost like it's a can of worms that they don't really want opened because it's too hard for them to deal with. They don't have the resources, they don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the tools, and they don't have the knowledge. So in a lot of those environments where they are by default seen as the owner of that thing, they don't have the tools to deal with it. So when they go out to look for how do we solve diversity and inclusion issues in our company, they kind of go for what the surface level is that they can see that's going to give them the ability to show that they're doing something that looks great but doesn't air their dirty laundry, if you like, doesn't go too close to that can of worms that they really don't want opened, if that makes sense. That's from an external point of view, that's what I see. The majority of them they're just not equipped necessarily to deal with it.
Yeah, I think I agree. It's usually someone in HR or people in culture that owns this work or owns the agenda and the initiatives that sit behind it. And of course, there are increasingly now a desire for it to be owned by the business or for it to be owned by leaders. But you're right, it's challenging because those people don't necessarily have the kind of deep expertise of Isa, for example, in order to drive it forward. But getting it out of a little thing in a busy portfolio of things that HR does, I think is a pretty important thing to making it a mainstream strategic concern. So I understand that HR functions often end up carrying most of the burden, but instilling a sense of responsibility and ownership for everybody in an organization, regardless of whether you have a formal leadership role or an informal leadership role. Everyone is a custodian of the organizational culture, and if D&I appears anywhere on your strategy, it should be owned by strategy owners, just like any other concern is. But it's tricky because for all of the reasons that you mentioned, Emma.
Yeah. What do you think? So you're in that sphere. Or what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's fear. Fear is driving this, sort of push towards people and culture and HR. It's like, they'll know how to handle it because it's those really tricky conversations that I don't really know how to handle, and they're bloody terrifying, and I just don't want to say the wrong thing. So I'll let that, they've got more risk tolerance maybe than I have in this space. So I'll put it there. But unfortunately, that's not a shared accountability. People, have to own this in some part themselves. I know organizations have built diversity and belonging and inclusion and equity OKRs into the business OKRs, which is a really effective way to do it. Unfortunately, they're usually the deeply passionate who go over and above because they're either from a minority background or a diverse category of employees, and they're just doing it because, like, who else is going to do it, right? So sometimes it falls on the shoulders of those who are most impacted by a lack of inclusive cultures, and that's not what you want to drive either. And so I would be really pushing for leaders to own it, for leaders to like put a stake in the ground and say, I'm going to champion this initiative throughout the organization, because that's how it's going to happen and that's how we're going to make change. Now, the other thing is with all what I've seen with all DEI initiatives is that they tend to be just something that fits into the current model or operation. To truly affect the outcomes we want to see, which is greater representation and seeing leaders with diverse backgrounds at the top and all the other good stuff that comes with that. It's around making change, like seismic change within the organization. It's so uncomfortable for people to sort of face up to. And, as those who are, in this work, you are a change maker. You're going to be met with more brick walls than you are welcome arms, and you have to have a sense of sort of resilience and persistence to be able to break through those. And I think that anyone in the organization can do it, and it has to be a collective effort.
I think I'd go also one further. Just to add to that is that when I think about who owns it, if you like, if I think about how much more knowledge there is about the profitability improvements in from having diversity at leadership level, I feel like the owners of businesses, so the senior leadership team, have almost a responsibility to shareholders. If they know that this is going to be a driver, surely they have some responsibility to make sure that happens in their organization to deliver greater shareholder value. And when I think about how, one of the things is that it feels like they're not explicit about what they, what they value in leadership. So if they are clear and explicit about what they value in leadership, if we're putting the onus on leaders, shouldn't there be a common, well-defined, ideal of what they value in leaders? And then that is almost a starting point. Rather than it be, and then people and culture is a strategic facilitator and a strategic development enabler to that. That's how I kind of see it, as being not just a D&I problem. I feel or a people and culture or HR problem to own, but it's more that it's something that's instilled, and a mind shift that has to come from the very top, the leadership team that knows this is what we're trying to achieve and this is how we need to achieve it. So we have to be explicit about what we value in leaders.
I think that's true, actually, and we're increasingly seeing that inclusive behaviours and inclusive norms worked into expectations around performance and KPIs for sure. But I think, and you will have had this frustration or challenge. If you want owners to own the process, you do need to give them the skills and the capabilities to do it. And for me, inclusion is a quality of teams and leaders that is a skill that can be built like any other. But fear, I think, has been a major issue over the last 18 months or so, with concerns around cancel culture. I'm working with two clients at the moment, leadership teams with two clients at the moment, who feel like what if I mangle the acronym? Is it Indigenous or Aboriginal? What if I don't get the right pronouns? I'd rather say nothing than risk sticking my foot in it. And of course, you say nothing, that's even worse. And so dealing with a lot of those fears and worries and trepidations about feeling like I don't know enough about this to speak confidently, I think is really important if we want leaders to own it. It's a capability that we need to work hard to provide.
It's the same with the women thing. It's, I think with women, men have become, or male leaders have become, fearful of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. With Me Too, ever since the Me Too movement started, I think that has instilled a bit of a fear around having women in their team, and that's not a place we really want it to be. But this is where the difference is. This is where I think the leadership capability around leading differences, managing people with differences, and actually, it's valuing for their differences.
Yeah. I think it's kind of good. There's, I don't know if that's me or getting some flavor. I don't know. There we go. Okay. It's good to hear that this is so inclusive leadership, something that we can all learn. It's something that all leaders should be responsible for, not just sitting in HR. People leave managers. They often aren't leaving companies. There's quite a number of studies to back this up. There was 3 separate ones that I read, and a lot of them are showing, so 30% of employees are engaged at work, so leaving the other 70% not engaged, and that managers account for about 70% of this variance. So disengaged workers, generally not highly productive or highly motivated. So doesn't really matter how you slice the data. The big picture is 60 to 70% of employees are simply not working as hard as they could be. How do you see inclusive leadership building into this? Does it impact motivation? Will it impact and make a change on those sorts of statistics? This is a question I'll throw out to all of you.
Who's going?
Well, I can say certainly we know you're absolutely right. I'm not sure what the interference is. I'll battle on. You're absolutely right that experience of your leaders is your biggest predictor of how inclusive an organisational culture feels, for sure. So certainly leadership has a massive, massive role to play.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that with some of the companies I work with, there's real, this is going to sound terrible, but there's really almost, well, there's overt bias. Okay, so leaders are some of the worst proponents of this, where they will, so I just want to mention the talent acquisition thing and how I think it needs a massive overhaul, because in light of what we're talking about, because I feel like there's a real drive from leaders in, certainly, again, this, I have to talk about technology because that's the space I work in, where they will say, we want people from universities. Who's that typing? Oh, that's really loud. We have people from, we want people from these universities, or we're saying these need to be, these are the things that we filter out. So if they haven't come from these universities, if they don't have this type of degree, if they don't, if they haven't come up through this particular route to get to where they're at, we're not interested. Those are the ones to filter out. But when you look at those institutions or those journeys, they are usually people who are quite privileged to have gone through that kind of journey in the first place. So we're really being quite discriminative at that point. And that often comes, I've seen it again in most of the organizations I've encountered, will have certain leaders that are more vocal about those things, and they're known in the business. So it'll be, okay, well, we don't want these people to go through that particular manager because that person is going to definitely veto this decision because they have a belief about this thing. And that's accepted, right? So people don't call that out internally because that could be somebody who is, you know, quite senior. So there is no safety around making that call out. So we haven't created a safe environment for that sort of thing to be discussed or called out. And then that also then filters down to an expectation on talent acquisition as to what they can and cannot put in front of certain people. You know, so this is where leaders, I think, have a really, you know, this is where I'm talking about, you know, having that definition of what the values are, being explicit about the values, because those leaders are not valuing the differences in the people that they're hiring. So they're the gatekeepers, and there's no one there to. I was listening to something recently with Michelle King, who the author of The Fix, and she talked about her first ever experience of I suppose the kind of misogynistic behaviour or the stuff that drove her to do what she does was when she went into a kitchen in her job where she was the only woman and her boss was a man, a white man. Middle-aged, and the other guys all in the kitchen were the same, and she walked in and he threw a tea towel at her and said, "Oh, you're the woman, you can do the washing up." And so she threw it back at him and said, "You've got two hands." And he said, "This is why I don't like working with women." Now the point is that what she said was that the other people in the kitchen who are her colleagues looked away. Most of them, you know, some of them sort of laughed along and some of them just couldn't look. So that's where, you know, we talk about safety to have these conversations. And this, what I'm talking about, is not uncommon in terms of not necessarily as severe as that, but it's that unwillingness to surface and call out and challenge the leaders who are having that, who are behaving in that way.
I think that's a really great point. We've seen an uptick, I think, over the last 12 months or so on work around what we might call upstander behaviour. So stepping in when you see something inappropriate, how best to do that. You know, certainly if you see something or you hear something exclusionary or inappropriate on some other level, you know, when you jump on people for things like that, you tend to get a pretty defensive response. It can be career limiting move, depending on the power relationship that exists between the offender and the person who's calling it out. It's an incredibly fraught area, I think, and certainly one that I think we need to give some attention to. Your example, Emma, is one of many that I hear constantly, particularly around things like organisational housework, if you know what I mean when I use that term. You know, taking the notes, organising the meeting room, bringing the glasses of water, sending a card around for so-and-so's birthday, cleaning up the kitchen. And we know, of course, from the Hilda data that organisational housework tends to be distributed in exactly the same way as housework at home, as in women get asked to do more and are expected to do more and sometimes offer to do more of this kind of stuff. And so it's one of those big opportunities for upstanding behaviour to kind of overturn that. But when you've got a very senior person involved, it can be a pretty fraught area for sure.
I'll just build on that, and I have to apologise. I think it was my headphones switching from my AirPods to the computer, so apologies to the audience for my interference there. Just to build on it, I think some practical ways that you can build that into your organisation is really focus on your values, and the behaviours that are driven by your values, and aligning with those very strongly to the point where you are prepared to make the bold decisions around moving people out of the business who don't align with those values. And there are trade-offs with everything, right? So this is part of those trade-offs. There are business trade-offs we make all the time, the risk-reward mechanisms that we have to take on board. So it's being as prepared to exit those leaders who don't align with those values and don't show up in these ways that are going to help further and foster a culture of inclusion and enablement and empowerment along these goals and ambitions of building a truly diverse and equitable workforce. So there's some of the things that I've seen work.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And we're increasingly having some conversations, but also moving past that whole, you know, tolerating the whole brilliant jerk kind of thing, where, you know, where people are tolerated because they are of such value to something operational or tangible, that we tolerate poor behaviour from them in other areas. You can see that now being tackled outside of the D&I space, but the impact that those people have on culture absolutely is huge. And I think Issa's right. It's really about connecting back to the values and deciding that comes first.
There's a lot of values out there in tech world that are that don't relate to, they're kind of trendy, they're rather than meaningful, so they can be a bit cliche from sort of early tech, I suppose, the kind of hard and fast, build the plane as you're flying it kind of approach, but that's followed through into values. And I think it's when you've got that culture of leadership at the very beginning that permeates and continues through value sets, that doesn't speak to the values that we're talking about what we value in our people, how we value difference, that's where you can get some real problems. I think where it's very hard then to shift if you have great values that you can use, that you can instill and embed and talk around and foster in your people and call out when there's misalignment to values. But what if your values are really, just I can think of a couple of companies, off the top of my head, that are actually have got pretty awful values that they see as being, really important to them, but they are glib at best, and just outdated.
I think I've got a scenario to share to get all of your feedback on, which I think links into that. It's probably a question that comes from organizations, like what you're talking about, Emma. So if we look at like the talent attraction piece, let's say you've got two shortlisted candidates, one's from an underrepresented group and the other is not. As a business, you're trying to hire more underrepresented groups, you're actively encouraging gender diversity, you're, I guess, ticking those boxes that you want to be ticking. Who should get the job? Should there be preferential treatment for the underrepresented candidate? And if there should be, is that even fair? Issa, do you want to maybe kick off from a TA perspective?
Yeah, I mean, that should never be the differentiator. Like, it should come down to who's best fit for the role and the team. And if you're doing your due diligence, you should have a really clear understanding of what your team looks like, how they're showing up, what the combination of talent is, and what are the skills that you need to enhance that team. The abilities, the perspectives, the lived experiences that are actually going to help the team go further. And I don't think it should ever be about like choosing one versus the other. By the end of that process, you should have the best lineup of candidates with the best skills and abilities who are going to further that team. And in more cases than not, it's probably from my very humble background, my perspective, the things that are missing are usually sitting within that person who has a different lived experience than the others on the team. And they're the ones that have a perspective and a voice, hopefully, and, a trajectory that has enabled them to be incredibly good at what they do, and can be an incredible asset to those teams. So I would think about it much earlier on in the process. I would think about not what you have at the end of the process of two candidates, you have to choose the two. Build that pipeline of incredibly diverse talent early, and then have a very fair process and keep it consistent, and make sure that you're using a diverse slate of interviewers, and ensuring that you're using your core competencies to drive assessment of those candidates. So at the end, it doesn't come down to who is diverse or not. It just comes down to who's best fit for the team. And
I think that's the holy grail, right? If you have diverse pools coming through, you don't really ever need to think about, do I have to hire the person who's diverse? But I will say this, and it's a hypothetical scenario, of course. It hardly ever happens that you just have two people who are identical in every way other than their demographics. But if you go back to the definition of inclusion as a culture that values difference, like we often take leaders through thought experiments where they put difference on their list of selection criteria.
Yes.
That actually would dictate that the diverse person has an additional skill to bring to the team that has value. So if you actually value difference, and if you actually walk the talk about valuing difference, then actually and I know it sounds suspiciously like I'm talking about quotas or targets here, and I'm not. I'm talking about if you value difference is a desirable characteristic. Let me tell you why this is a little bit difficult, though, sometimes, if we stick with the hypothetical 2 identical candidates. Never happens, but imagine it does. And you go to recruiters, headhunters, people who hire for a living, and you say, if you have 2 identical candidates, can't split them on paper, what one factor determines who you're going to hire? Over 90% of them will say fit. I'm going to pick the person who's best fit. If you then ask them what's fit, they start to scratch their chins a little bit. They go, oh, X factor, charisma, that certain something. I can tell within 5 minutes of a candidate walking into the room whether they've got what I want or not, etc. I'm an expert. And you go, great, okay, but what's fit? Write me a list of characteristics you think the candidate would have if they fit here. And they write you a list of traits and characteristics. If you then ask them to write a list of traits and characteristics that they personally have that have helped them to be successful in their career, they write you a list of traits and characteristics. What do you think happens when you look at the 2 lists? It's the same traits and characteristics. Fit is, it's a movable feast. We don't measure it objectively. What fits in one organization is different to what fits in another, is different to what fits in 2 different teams in the same organization. We tend humanly to define fit in self-referential terms. I fit here. If you're quite like me, you'll fit here too. And that's where we see this slippage from a perfectly reasonable concern with looking for people who are values aligned to asking things like, would you have a beer with this person? Would you like to be stuck next to this person on a long haul flight? So this idea of fit, I think we need to be really careful about not overshooting. It's very difficult to get a good fix on a person's deep values in a half-hour interview to start with, and they're all going to tell you what you want to hear anyway. And starting to incorporate, I think as Lisa mentioned, a consideration of, yes, get along ability is an important thing, but it's not more important than capability. So tempering this idea with fit, with an idea of culture add. And I think Issa kind of described that quite quickly. What will bring something to the team that the team needs that it doesn't already have lots of? And so a balanced comparison of values alignment, fit-ish, and also a consideration of culture add. And that, again, favors the person who brings a different perspective. It puts a value on difference.
I think one of the things that we struggle with in reality, because the theory is clear and strong, in practice, what happens is talent acquisition are given briefs, they're overworked, they probably don't have enough. There's probably not enough of them. So they have, 10, 15, 20 roles to fill. And we give them a bunch of criteria that says, hire against this. Difference isn't in there. So where does that start? Does it start with leadership? Does it start with leadership being clear about what they value? And if they value difference, shouldn't it be in the values? Shouldn't it then be in the hiring process as far as if you value difference, you've got to get your TAs to go out and find differences for your pipeline. Otherwise, all you're going to get is the same demographic. You're just going to get the same set of same. And that's what you're then having to pick from. And you don't get that scenario, Mel, that you described. I've seen it so few times, and I've been in this industry for 26 years, where you've got, and I'll tell you exactly what happens in those situations. You've got the lowering the bar conversation that happens inside a leader's head. You've also got man, woman, both with a similar background. What you haven't got the recognition of is the playing field was very different for those people. So the man who got to that point would not have had to go through the hurdles that the woman who got to that point would have had to go through, which gives her a clear advantage at the end of the day. What you will get is that this is the guy that everybody else wants to go for a beer with and can see themselves going for a beer with down the path. And he's on the same page as me, and he thinks like I do, therefore I can trust him more easily than I can trust her. So those are the things that are at play at the background. So you have to tackle it way before that. And you can't leave it to TA or talent acquisition, and recruiters to do that work for you. The decision making has to come further back in the process, in the decision making about what we value.
Absolutely, and I think you kind of need some skilled decision makers too. We sit in on talent calibrations and on recruitment processes as part of some of the consultancy work that we do, and it never ceases to amaze me how often a talk about a conversation about two close calls, two reasonably desirable candidates, or people to be selected into a development program or a hypo program. And it never ceases to amaze me, the frequency with which it comes down to, yeah, but he's just a better, or he's a great bloke. And when there's a close call, those are the kinds of slippery subjectivities. Get along ability, be easier to manage, get their feet under the desk quicker, not upset the delicate balance of my team. It'll be easier for me, that it tends to come down to, for sure, which flies in the face of any of our good intentions around valuing difference. And certainly one of the reasons why something like unconscious bias still kicking around in this agenda is that your unconscious brain does not value difference. That's not what it's designed to do. It's designed to filter it out. So yeah, for sure, it's certainly
every job description will say, you go on LinkedIn now or Seek or any of those and run those adverts. Almost guaranteed 99% of them will say, we value diversity and difference in all our people.
Yeah,
not a belief in the leadership team necessarily. That's the bit that has to be, there's got to be some accountability on that statement. Yes. But it's a strap line.
Absolutely. It's a nice intention, but there's a huge difference between good intentions and putting things into action, for sure.
I think action is a good point. Just I feel like we could speak about this for 3 or 4 more hours. There's so much to touch on, but I think you all three of you have made it very clear that there's a need for diversity. It creates better business outcomes, and it's everyone's responsibility. And it comes from remolding the workplace and not just TA saying we want diversity. It needs to be everyone's responsibility. So we've been very lucky to have 3 very unique speakers here today. So I would ask if you could all share your one top tip or one action item that everyone that's joined this webinar could take away and start doing today to kind of start creating this change. What would it be? Isa, if you want to.
I'll jump in because I kind of had one last comment on the last part, but it kind of segues really nicely into this summary. It's not a zero-sum game. There are opportunities for everyone, everywhere. So on the last question, I was like, is there a choice to be made? Can we not just hire both people? I know that in one scenario at Spotify, we have, 8 senior execs, and the CEO just said, let's add 2 more spots. Let's add chairs or seats. No one's leaving, so let's add more seats so we can create more opportunities and fill those seats with the talent that we want to see and the minds we want to see from diverse backgrounds and perspectives and lived experiences. So I think it's challenging the rules. The rules have only served us for so long and so far. So let's think about it in a different way. Let's just create more opportunities. And when we do create more opportunities, they enable more people to get ahead as well. So I think maybe stop looking at it into these finite ways and challenge the status quo and how it exists and how it shows up for your organization. And stop calling diversity a constraint. It is not. It is an incredibly powerful tool. If we just commit to it and believe in it, incredible things can happen.
Yeah.
Amazing. And Emma, I'm sure you've got some more than one great tip with your work through Project F and your 50/50 program. What would you say would be the biggest takeaway for people to start actioning?
I've written down a couple. So one of them I think is more of a personal. What can everybody here who's attended today or is watching this back, what can they do personally themselves? And the first thing is to accept the premise that we might not be aware of our differences and our different lived experiences in the people in our organization. So accepting that premise is the first thing. So that means in order to accept that, I would give them the homework to go away and educate themselves to the point where they can articulate why it matters to you. Why does it matter to you? To me, so I can go and say why it matters to me that so finish the sentence. A more equal workplace will benefit me because So if they can go and educate themselves to the point of that, that will be the one thing. The second thing is more of an organization. What can your organization do? The one thing is to define what good looks like in your leaders. If you can define what good looks like in your leaders, you know, what does it look like in our organization? What do we value? That's, to me, one of the biggest starting points anyone can go away with from this.
I love that. And Jennifer, you're obviously consulting with execs on this all the time. What would you say is the number one or the tip that hasn't been covered already?
Yeah, there's kind of always two flips for me that stick out when I do this work. One is that whole, you know, inclusion is not about fitting diverse people in, it's about growing our culture to take better advantage. The second flip, though, for me, and maybe this is homework that everybody can do after the call today, is another thought experiment. I love thought experiments. The thought experiment is to ask yourself this: what's it like to work here if I wasn't me? And write down the initials of the person you're thinking of. It's someone in your team, either your team of peers or the team you lead if you're a leader, you don't know very well. They're not in your little similarity bias bubble of confidants and familiars. They're new to the organisation. They're less senior. They don't get to work in their first language. It could be anything. Somebody who's really not having the same experience as you. And really picture that person. Write down their initials. Don't tell someone who they are. And try to flesh out what their experience of your workplace is, or of you as a leader, if you're their leader. What's it like to work here if you're not me? And then if you're feeling really brave, turn the thought experiment into a real experiment. Go and have coffee with them.
I love it. Wow.
Virtually, of course.
For now. We'll be back to real coffee soon. So that's great. I think everyone can go away, start challenging the status quo, stop calling D&I a constraint, a powerful tool, and a few things to do a bit of homework. So a more equal workplace would benefit me because, go and finish that sentence, and what would it look like to work here if I wasn't me, and choose someone outside my bubble? I really like that, and I think that's a very powerful start to drive some change. And it's nice to leave a webinar with some action points. So huge thank you to the three of you for joining today. I've found it really interesting and very eye-opening, and I'm sure our audience has as well. So yes, thank you all for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Really enjoyed it.
And thanks everyone for joining.